to the latest edition of It's Not Just Hot Air, the podcast from the Pilot Group. So I am joined by Josh from the Pilot Group.
As always.
As always. Like hi, Josh. Yeah. But we have a guest today. We have Luke from Enviroheat. Luke, do you want to just tell everyone about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm the commercial director of Enviroheat, and basically front-facing client management, dealing with sort of a lot of different sectors, certainly in sort of commercial and industrial, all the way through to domestic. And yes, Enviroheat set up in 2012, so been going a fair distance now. And yes, we're a manufacturer based here in Manchester that sort of creates energy efficient, low carbon electric heating and hot water products. So yeah, that's a little bit about us.
Excellent, thank you. So tell us a little bit about Enviroheat's history and sort of particularly the journey to the HET technology that you've now got and kind of what that's delivering.
Yeah, so there is a good story to the way that Enviroheat was set up. So our technical director, Cedric, is French, and they were a group of engineers that were working at CERN, at the Large Hadron Collider. And that's where the inception of this kind of, how do we make the most energy demanding products more efficient? And as we all know, certainly domestically, 80% of household bills come from heating and hot water. Commercially, it's a little bit different, a little bit more like 50, 60, depends on the processes, but it's quite a chunk. So whilst these engineers are smashing particles together at the speed of light and they're chatting around the coffee table, they're starting to think about their energy at home. And they're obviously doing a lot of different things, a lot of different side projects as well at the Collider. And they said that a lot of the heating in Europe at the time, obviously powered by nuclear, was electric, direct electric. And they said, well, these things aren't really efficient. There's not really been much movement in terms of development of the technologies. So they set about trying to figure out how to make them better. And from then, they sort of collaborated, made a prototype which looked, to say agricultural would be generous. This thing was...
Bit Heath Robinson, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very Heath Robinson, very inspired by him. And it was... But you could see a kernel of something that might be quite good.
Yeah.
And then they developed that. And from there, they wanted to commercialize it. And of all of the markets in Europe, the UK was actually quite the most prominent in terms of electric heating and how to sort of improve that. So we got set up over here, and then I got involved. And this took a long period of time, lots of research and development and things like that.
Yeah,
but
I can imagine.
From there, in about 2015, after quite a few years of R&D, we started the first sort of pilot projects into social housing. After we developed this kind of energy efficient bolt-on to a radiator, essentially,
and made it look a bit prettier.
And made it look. We thought prettier, but then clients were still like, it's not quite there. So further iterations and things like that. But yeah, we kind of, that's the spirit of seeing a problem and then innovating towards it, and not just saying, well, that's all we've got. We always want to challenge that status quo, and that's core for what we did in the early days right through to where we stand now, which is, we were the first, I think we were the first anyway, the electric heating panel manufacturer to integrate a room thermostat rather than the temperature sensor being on the heater, which makes sense because why have a white thing on a wall that's 100 degrees and the temperature sensor's on the thing? Makes sense to put it in the room. So we thought we didn't think that was anything clever, really, but a lot of people said, "Oh, that's actually a good idea." That
sometimes stuff, the simplest ideas can be the most revolutionary for an industry, and we find that I think still with a lot of AC units. I think that the sensors are still housed in the unit itself, and hot air rises. So
and that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's very different to residential. I know we're going to get onto that in a bit about the differences and the commonalities between residential and commercial, but in your home the thermostats are in the room, not on the boiler, for example.
That's it.
Yeah,
it's exactly that. It was actually it was a sort of a boiler relay. We were the first one ever to integrate the Honeywell controls into it, and Honeywell was wireless room thermostats.
Yeah,
and that was driven from our housing association clients that said, because we initially had a sensor on the bottom of the unit, and we weren't quite happy with it. And they said, what about if you do this? And we said, great idea. We'll integrate, and then we'll improve on that, and machine learning and things like that. So yeah, we're always looking at ways that we can do things better, and collaborating with clients and customers. I think any good manufacturer should always have a finger on the pulse of where the products are going and how it's been responded to in the market. Not just setting up a production line and saying that's all we spit off the end of it and that's all you're getting. I think that way you never really understand how you can improve. It's just that's what we've always done. That's how we're always going to do it. I think you need that collaboration with your client base and your customers.
Definitely. I think continuous feedback loops it doesn't matter what market I think you work in. Any good continuous feedback loop helps you get the product of tomorrow.
Yeah.
Otherwise, someone will eventually always catch up with you.
Yeah.
Definitely.
They do.
Definitely, because technology only gives you an advantage for a certain period of time until the next best thing comes along. So tell us a little bit about the HET technology that you have, because I understand that's making some waves.
Yeah. So it's quite innovative. So the HET stands for hydroelectrothermics. Okay, so heating, electricity, and water. So those three core principles there are what is central to all of our products that goes through. So essentially, inside of our radiator panel, there's a pump, there's a heat exchanger, some controls. So quite simple and rudimentary parts, but they are the building blocks for any heating system. You need a transfer of energy to heat, and however that's generated, either it's by burning gas or electricity, etc. So ours is electricity. And basically, we circulate water around a radiator panel at a consistent speed and flow rate. And from there, we can manage precisely the amount of energy that you put into the heater. And then that's obviously extended into the room itself. So with that's our core patented technology there. And that has enabled us to create essentially an electric panel heater that will only use a maximum of 600 watts of electricity to heat a panel up to 55 degrees, which will heat a room in turn. So it's incredibly efficient. And the difference that has between a traditional panel heater is essentially a traditional panel heater will have either a tungsten wire or some form of element. And essentially, an element is just basically pushing electricity through something that doesn't like it, okay, which creates resistance and then provides light and heat as a byproduct. There hasn't really been much innovation from that point. And it uses a lot of energy. So although you'll kind of flash fry a room, you'll have sort of 2 kilowatts going into this thing and walloping a room full of it. It shocks the fabric, it shocks the building and the air, and then it'll turn off because the sensor's on the product. It'll turn off and then it'll cool and then it'll heat up again. And you'll have what we have like a sawtooth sort of heating profile, which isn't really efficient. So what we decided to do is rather than instantly use 2,000 watts, and if you've got a whole room full of, let's say, 10 heaters, well, that's 20 kilowatts that you're suddenly pulling from the grid, which isn't going to help when we generate our energy as well. So at the front end, we said, well, 0.6 is enough to heat a radiator panel with water that we know how to play with to heat a room to 21. You don't need a white thing on a wall at 100 degrees when you want the room to be 21. So it's a waste of energy there. So we decided to use low and slow methodology, similar to a heat pump, where the flow rates for them are 50, 55 degrees, okay, to heat the rooms low and slow. So with that, you can now have electric buildings that don't pull on the grid as much, which means things are much more stable for the local area. Tower blocks, etc., with lots of instantaneous heaters. Remove those. Low and slow means everything's much more stable for that. And running costs are lower as well. So that the power of that HET technology has enabled us, certainly in the heater products that we make, to reduce electrical heating bills by, on average, 30%, which is phenomenal. And that's the same for sort of domestic mostly, but also into industrial space as well. Office spaces are quite a popular one. Anything that has panel heaters really is a great replacement for that.
Does that mean it has to work in a similar way to a heat pump, where you have almost like an always-on style, or is there a specific scheduling capability that you need to hit?
Yeah, so it's very flexible really with that, because you are right. The pump will always circulate the water going around the heater, and the immersion elements inside the heat exchanger will engage as an external stimulus to the thermostat. So it will always be circulating the water, which obviously is charged full of the heat energy, and then that will continue to release and release and release. So you have a battery that's flexible. But yes, does prefer to have consistent temperatures across multiple zones. However, there's always the argument, and it's quite the right argument really in terms of electric heating, which is don't always overheat a room that you're not in. So you do want to zone things off, and you do want to have, if we think domestically, you don't always want to have your bathroom on all the time. You want to reduce that. Your hallways, etc. Your lounge areas are going to be the ones where you're going to spend the majority of your time. Bedrooms, etc. are slightly different, depends on who you are and how you live. But essentially, you want that background heat for a long period of time. You don't want thermal shocks to the fabric. Okay, so again, if you think of everything as batteries or ways to store energy, your building fabric is an essential one as well. You've got this sort of initial charging up of the area, and then you play with that, whatever's been retained, whatever's gained from solar, etc., and moving around. So it's kind of a blend of both, really. And the technology will learn exactly how the environment behaves, etc. So those technologies have been around for a very long time.
So how do you manage that? Because you mentioned you work with housing associations and putting this technology into their properties. How do you manage that control? Because obviously there's people in those properties who have minds of their own.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So with the housing sector, the customers have their own agency, so they can use the system however they'd like. We always provide advice and detailed handovers, and we work with some phenomenal installers and some installation teams that really do look after the customers, really, because there's a long established way of fit and forget. And if you're creating an investment, you don't fit and forget something. You fit and you monitor it, and it's an investment. Regardless of who the end client is, i.e. council tenants, etc., or whether it's a commercial building manager, etc., you want to make sure that the measures you're putting in are being respected and
so they can achieve the targets they're trying to
exactly.
achieve. Yeah.
So I always say to some of the customers, and I tend to like to go to site to see the end customers. Because I never get tired of seeing the products out in the wild, if I'm honest. I genuinely enjoy it. But there's the Spider-Man thing, which is, with great power comes great responsibility. Yeah. So that's what I say to them, and they always get a giggle at that. But it's true. It's like, you now have control over how you want to live in your property. Here are the capabilities of the products, and they're very efficient. Okay, so it's with you to play with that, and for you to make sure that you can position it, change whatever you need to change, and adapt it to how you live. And understand that and work with it. Okay, it's not something that's going to dictate your life. You're in control of it. So with that, the customer has control. When you take a look at sort of student accommodation and NHS and those other kind of in-betweeny bits between commercial and domestic, then there's the question of control. And office spaces as well is a good one. Okay, so being able to set a comfortable working temperature.
No group of people is always happy with the temperature.
Exactly. And it's an eternal argument, I think. But nevertheless, we have systems in there that can be controlled from a central point, in which case it is set for the building and it's comfortable for what it is. There are certain areas in certain buildings where you need to keep a temperature controlled environment, and you need to make sure it's consistent. So therefore, set it, maintain it, and off you go. And then there are other areas where breakout rooms, meeting rooms, etc., if it's not being regularly used, turn it down, and then you've got a little bit of agency to get in the room and turn it on. So again, it's as flexible, as complicated as you'd like the system to be, and that's how we've designed it, really. But yeah, control is always an interesting point.
It's the similar things that we have, but obviously we're doing it more in the actual manufacturing space itself. Obviously, pretty much all of those, I think we see an office space attached to them anyway, but we have the same thing where we're centralizing the control of it. And there we've always found that there has to be an education piece and there has to be an engagement with staff, otherwise they'll try and find a way to combat the system. And it's just human nature. If you've not been told why something's been put in, if you can find a way around the system to make your life more comfortable, that's why that constant communication has to be there to make sure that this environment is comfortable to work in, because we're not here to install a technology just to make everyone miserable in their lives here. We're here.
That's not the target.
No, we're here to. We always talk about we're here to help save costs, save carbon, and increase comfort and increase control. And they're the 4 areas, and we don't want to compromise one just in sight of the other one. And there's always a balance to be found.
Well, and now there's much more emphasis on sustainability, both from an individual point of view and a corporate point of view. I think once people understand what you're trying to achieve from a sustainability perspective, I think people are much more willing to be or to compromise on the heat situation and pop a jumper on, for example.
I think in any life, no one likes really a surprise.
No.
Like whether that's just a change to your life that you weren't expecting.
Yeah.
Obviously, they can be good and bad, but actually, if
Definitely.
you suddenly make someone's life a little bit more awkward without telling them the reasoning behind it, I think it's the same with any sustainable technology in the future. I think the ones that are succeeding are the ones that have the minimal impact on life changes to someone. If you can make it easy for them to make the change to a more sustainable option without impacting their life as much,
Yes.
they're the ones that are thriving, because people go, actually, it's worth that ever so slight compromise I have to make. The one where it's huge compromise, that becomes a bigger challenge in changing someone's behaviour that's been ingrained with them.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, we rent our offices from a well-known serviced office company who I think could do with some of this, because the temperature is a constant surprise in every office we go to. So, yes, I can imagine that. So we've touched a little bit on residential and commercial applications. And I think this is more a question for sort of people watching the podcast around, because we all have thermostats at home, we all have boilers at home, so we think that we know how to manage it. But obviously a commercial space can be very different, because you've got, like you say, you've got offices, you've got warehouses, so there's lots of different subcategories in there as well. What are some of the commonalities between those two applications and some of the differences?
I mean, so it's a broad question as such, but so we work entirely in the business to business space, in the environments. I think it's more of, we treat our energy from what we know, and what we know is typically what we use in our house. So I think we find that most people probably go, what temperature should we set it at? Let's go 20, 21, because that's what, I don't know, my mum did. So that's what then I've done with my house. But actually, never stop to think, is that required? And then I think we do the same often in our industrial spaces, because you base the temperature you often set in your industrial space on what you know, and what you know is what you've done at home. So we've often worked with businesses and we'll set a temperature. We might start at, say, 15, 16, and especially if you've got a workforce who are up and moving a lot of the time, that might be satisfactory for it. We don't want to work against the people here and make them in an uncomfortable environment, but every degree matters. It's a couple of percent off the energy bills. So I think it's about 5%. If your typical temperature is about 20 degrees, every degree is about 5% off that. So if we can help bring that down to what is still a comfortable environment, but it's going to save you the most money, why wouldn't we work with you on that? And that again goes back to the communication piece of ongoing and making it comfortable, but making it the best cost and carbon saving model that we can.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the biggest difference, isn't it, between commercial and residential, sort of having that iterative approach to temperature management, because you have so many different applications of the heat, like you say, an office versus a warehouse where people are managing, working and throwing things around.
I think as well, there's a different mentality often, just because in your own home you're paying the bills here.
Yeah.
So you're probably going to want to have visibility of it. And I think where probably smart meters have probably had a positive impact on the world is actually you knowing what you're using, and you might go, okay, maybe I'll change my behaviours here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there'd possibly be the same in a working environment if you showed people what they were using and the decisions that, what decisions they make that contribute to that.
Yeah, because that's a good point. They probably have no idea what the electricity bills are or gas bills are in the business, because they're so far removed from that process. So from your point of view, what are the things that you've seen in like big differences or commonalities between the two markets?
Well, I think that's exactly right. Where you're at home, you have complete autonomy and you have control over things. When you're at work and you're not the building services manager, or you're just trying to get on with your job, then you're kind of at the whim of either what the building's performing at, so whether the heating system is exactly sort of doing exactly what it's prescribed to do, or whether there's some faults and failures and things like that. But also there's no sort of form of control, and it is what it is. Okay, and I think from an analysis point of view, it's like I say, it's instant feedback loop. It's every month. Oh, there's the bill. There's the bill. Okay, how much is coming in? How much is coming out? Whereas commercially work. It might be quarterly. It depends on how you get billed, etc.
And if anyone manages it, I guess.
Exactly that is. There's not always someone with a finger on the pulse. They look at the end of the year, do the financial accounts and go, oh dear, what happened there? Well, why weren't we tracking it and monitoring it? And that's when things start to happen. And so there is a bit of a disconnect. But again, it's not the primary function of what we're working for, is it? The heating. Okay, it's not on the top of the list.
No.
It's not up there. However, when you start to get seismic shifts in the industry and have global events that cause the price of energy to rocket, suddenly then it comes to the forefront and we say, we do have to be dealing with this now, because this is quite damaging. If we've had a trebling of our energy consumption, not even energy consumption, sorry, if we've had a trebling of our energy costs, then we need to address that pretty rapidly. And how can we, make efficiencies? So it's this bits and starts really with what takes priority in business, and it is a little bit like whack-a-mole. There could be supply chain issues that take more precedence, increased in raw material costs, etc., versus operationally what we're doing. And then you think about things like expansion, and I know that can happen domestically. Like you might put an extension on, okay, and then you've got a little bit more footprint to hit, but it's not as relatively
and probably
impactful.
Not as drastic
exactly as a business acquiring another building across the road and then connecting the two, and then how do we connect one to the other? So in those circumstances, it depends on when you review sort of the costs and your regular spending, etc. I think those are the differences really. Is commercially seems to be a little bit more reactive rather than proactive, but not now when things are coming to the forefront. In terms of controllability, etc., you've got typically in commercial it's wide spaces, okay, so fairly consistent temperatures, and even if things are zoned off into different applications, spot heat and things like that might be worthwhile taking a look at. But domestically at home, it is what it is. Make sure you're controlling things a little bit more efficiently, and you can make the pennies count.
Yeah.
Those there are a lot of commonalities between the two.
Yeah.
Very few differences from my perspective anyway. Certainly on the heating side. So.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, and like you said, Josh, we all think we're experts at this. And I guess as well for those companies who are moving towards net zero carbon by 2030, 2050. It's officially 2050.
Things might change from a government standpoint, but the initial target was 2050, and it may come closer again.
They're talking about that, aren't they? Sort of bringing it closer. And I guess from a commercial point of view, for a company who is perhaps being pressured to make sustainability savings because of their customers, the SLAs and they're trying, because we were talking earlier, weren't we, about ensuring sustainability throughout the supply chain is difficult, but I guess this gives companies trying to do that a big advantage and a quick win almost on that.
I think so. I think it's often driven by some of the bigger companies and bigger entities, so actually if you can get ahead of it, it's a pretty good place to be. I think we've seen some customers be forced to look at it by a much larger entity who then will probably dictate their sales, because that's a huge contract that they're bidding for, and if they don't play by the rules, then they are going to suffer in that sense. So it's probably everyone's interest to be proactive and look at it, because if you're not legislated by it now, you probably will be in the future.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. It depends on how you want to frame it. If you want to frame it quite positively, then you'll do well and you'll actively make the changes and you'll reap the benefits of it. If you view it as something that just has to be done and you'll get round to it, you do run a significant risk of not being picked for, like, say, those contracts that are saying, well, how much have you done in your sustainability journey? Have you done an assessment of even just your scope 1 and 2, never mind scope 3, and onwards? Is have you started to do the work? Because if you haven't, then unfortunately we have to move with someone who, potentially is doing a lot more and trying to improve things, because we all have a part to play, and that's the thing that seems to be for certain organisations, we all have a part to play, seems to be missed, and you could say that larger organisations, because they've sort of acquired a lot of the market, etc., and contracts, that they can just sort of sit there and dictate further down the supply chain to, well, you sort yourself out first, and then we'll take a look at ours. And by virtue of you sorting yourself out, we've initially, we've taken...
we've ticked a box.
Exactly,
Yeah.
we've ticked those boxes. So there needs to be some ownership from the much larger corporations, but at the same time, your more nimble, dynamic businesses that are wanting to do more. And it doesn't matter what business you're in. There are some fantastic case studies in and around Manchester at the moment with businesses that are doing all sorts of things to decarbonise that have got them bigger and better contracts, more revenue, and it's this virtuous cycle keeps spinning upwards.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said for taking a look at this and taking it very seriously, because you will be selected, and it's not as if it's a bad thing. Decarbonising, it's for
No, I mean, and it's now it is so much at the top of the agenda. I think more so than it has been. So where do companies start? So where's a good place for them to start? Do you have to rip and replace all of the stuff, the heating infrastructure that you might have?
So I think I kind of go against the grain on this one. You do yourself out of sales sometimes, but when an organisation approaches and says we have this particular issue and we're looking to decarbonise and we're wanting to do the best we can, and we will try to find the budget to do this. And they will have had maybe a consultant come out and say the existing, let's just call it a commercial boiler, etc. That with all the ancillary things, and certain areas of the building aren't fit for purpose and they've been decommissioned, etc. They say, right, we'll rip the whole thing out. It's been condemned, and so sometimes I'll say that's not the best thing to do. In all honesty, if think pragmatically about this, okay. There's something to be said for analysing what's there in situ and making it work better. Some of the systems that were put in 10 years ago shouldn't really be being ripped out now. If they weren't designed correctly, alter the design and make sure that you get a proper company in that can analyse that, and then maybe do a little bit extra where you were thinking of starting from, rather than saying gut the whole thing, spend £250,000 on adjusting how we function as a business, etc. is take a look at what can be fixed. It might be that your valve control centre or your wiring centres, etc., just need to be upgraded so that water can flow better, or things like that. Adjust radiator sizes if they're oversized at the moment, and that can increase your efficiencies. Or try and take a look at the existing system and don't just gut it. Okay. Now that obviously will reduce the amount of work that we can get, but there's something to be said for even doing a little bit is better than...
Well, and more sustainable, because then you're not just chucking everything out.
Exactly. And you can forecast it into your annual expenditure for, well, we know we're doing phase 1 now. We know we're doing phase 2. And that's not just the case for large organisations that work in 3-year phases. That's for small SMEs to say, well, what we're doing now, well, we can put some sort of inhibitor in the system. We can add some new radiators, etc. Whatever it is, those small measures to make things flow a little bit better, and then adjust the way the business works around it. That will make such a difference. And we're not talking 5%, we might be talking 15-20%. And that capex that they allocated can go to somewhere else, and then until phase 2, etc.
Yeah, so and sort of reinvest in that activity.
Precisely, yeah. They might be able to do something that that is low-hanging fruit, that's actually more visual as well, to demonstrate we're doing something. So rather than ripping out the gas system, adjust something, make some controls, do electric heating if you want in certain areas there, and then invest a bit in solar PV. So you've got a signal there to say this is what we're doing. It's genuinely working in the system, and you've got a hybrid for the moment, rather than, well, if we do this, then it means that we've got to lay some people off. Now, I know that's an extreme example and that would never happen, but those considerations of saying we've got this amount of money to invest in this, it's crippling and therefore we can't do anything. Well, that's the worst thing that you can get, which is
not to do any action.
Exactly. It's too big, we can't do it, we can't afford it. So I'm a big advocate for, even domestically, like whatever market you're in, wherever you're positioned, is to do a little bit if you can. If you want to do the whole hog, fantastic, and I'm there for you all day. But there's nothing wrong with just doing a little bit at a time, and I think that's quite controversial to take, at the moment anyway.
Yeah, I think, well, you're preaching for the converted on our side with the way that we do business. Is I know we work with industrial gas heaters. Yeah. That's our sweet spot. We're not an advocate for gas heating, because we know actually the long-term benefit is to replace that with something that's going to be more renewable. Yeah. But we know we can go in, attach a system, just simply a control system to those existing heaters. Don't have to rip them out, and we can reduce on average by 43% the amount they consume. That money then saved can be put to one side to then have, I think I've banged this drum probably on many podcasts we've done, that you can then have that pot of money, put it aside for your next step of project. Yep. And that could be whether it's taking a look at ripping a system out in the future, or whether you build up that budget capex wise, especially from electricity point of view. I always think reduce before you then put an installation, especially like something like solar. So you might not need as larger installation if you then reduce the amount that you're consuming. So it's a great place to start, but I think that is understanding your picture as a business, understand what's viable, and then understand what stages you might want to do it in. That doesn't mean you have to have a 5-year energy plan of what you do, but it's knowing that you've got options. If you make this one tweak now, in a year's time, you might have 2 or 3 options that you can go and do.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just before we wrap up, I think that's a nice segue into what goes on from a political and a legal standpoint in terms of what legislation is coming down the line, you know, what companies and, you know, housing associations with all the properties they manage are going to have certain requirements and targets. So I think, you know, it would be good to get both of your views on emissions targets, deadlines. You know, we were talking about the shift from 2050 to 2030, like how feasible that even is. It's not that far away, scarily. Yeah, so it'd be good to get both of your views on that.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, after you.
I think I always say, number one, I'll stay away from the political element of it.
Smart move.
Yeah. Well, everyone has their views. I think the sooner, obviously, the better. You know, there's much smarter people out there who are telling us what the data says, and I'm not going to argue with the people that have been in this position researching it for years. They obviously know far more than I do. I think the sooner the better. I think it's all well and good setting a target. If you don't outline how someone's or businesses in particular are going to be able to get there, the support has to be there. Otherwise, we're just setting a target for setting a target's sake. If there's a plan outlined of how to get there, then great. And let's help the businesses do that. Let's give them, whether it's grants, whether it's give them education and support, but just help them on that journey. It's a really difficult space. Sustainability as an area has grown massively, and there's a whole host of technologies out there. And whatever might be the popular one or the buzzword of the time is where people's mind drifts to, because that's just our nature as people. It's what we feel comfortable with, so we're going to go close to that. So let's help educate people on what the entire picture looks like, so then they can make an informed decision about where they go first. I think that's probably as far as I look into it. You know, we're dictated on legislation. That'll come when it comes, from who it comes for. So businesses will have to follow. I think the big thing is we know it's coming. If you haven't already been put under those pressures, if you don't already fall into ESOS schemes, having to report your emissions, I know that I think for government contracts you have to have a net zero plan. I don't think you're currently held to it, but maybe you will start to be held to it.
Yeah.
So we know all these things are coming. So actually, if you can get ahead of the curve, why wouldn't you? Because these technologies now aren't just sustainable solutions for the sake of it. You can put a sustainable solution in that also has a return on investment for your business. Yeah. So if you can do both at the same time,
why wouldn't you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think you're exactly right there, Josh, which is, you know, the buy-in from everyone is critical for anything to move forward. Carrot and stick and all that. I'm not so sure. You do need this education piece and get people to sort of come on board with it. I think from a legislation point of view and things like that, if we look domestically, but it still applies to commercial. If you look at EPCs, energy performance certificates, one of the way that government measures the success of decarbonisation is to look at the improvement in these energy performance certificates. It's widely known throughout the manufacturing industry anyway, whenever we make a product that is more efficient than what's been done before, that when we take a look at the buildings being assessed, they will go through SAP assessments, standard assessment procedures, and even better, RD SAP, which is reduced data, and the key is reduced. So we're being held to overly simplified lists, and you're categorised as this, and therefore that gives a token amount to the assessment and the points in an EPC assessment. So where you might have the best, most energy efficient product on the market, it's still lumped in with all the rest of them and says, it doesn't really matter that you spent an extra X amount of pounds on this, it's still categorised as this. And not only that is that not I mean, everyone whinges about it, and I'm no different. You know, I do love a moan about it. You know, but you have to find people that are willing to overlook that if they've got other measures in place that are already sort of put into the buildings, etc., to cover that. Let's say oversight in the value of the product that's being put in, or the solution. But I think it's more fundamental than that, which is the metrics that government use to measure the success of decarbonisation. The SAP structure is based on the cost of energy, not the carbon intensity of the energy source.
Right.
Which is the biggest issue with the whole thing, which is electricity in the UK is coupled with gas generation. And the capacity markets and all of the rest of the pricing structure is built around those two things. And if we're basing our energy performance in buildings on the cost of energy, whereas gas is cheaper than electricity, it will promote gas. Okay.
Yeah.
That's not the best thing, is it? So there needs to be a fundamental shift, which is we understand the reasons for it, and it's more domestically focused 100%. Because if you rip out a lot of gas and then fit in a lot of electric, we've got issues with infrastructure, first of all, but then you've also got the issue of increased costs of it, because we don't generate enough of our own electricity, although we are starting to move towards severely mitigating that issue. So the thing needs an overhaul, and everyone's crying out for it, but this is a big thing to manage.
It's a big thing to change.
It is. It is a super tanker that's trying to change course.
Yeah.
You know, do a right hand turn.
Well, and you know, to be crude, there's probably a lot of people who, in their interests, it's not in their best interest to change it.
Oh, now we're stepping on eggshells.
We said,
love it.
We said we wanted a little bit of controversy.
Yeah.
To be fair, I only learned recently for the EPC rating things, I didn't think it had that much impact on my life in a domestic capacity.
Yeah.
But then I've gone at looking at buying a house, and I can't get a best mortgage rate unless I have an AB EPC rating for the house.
Really? Oh, that's
I assume it
interesting.
stems from banks' own carbon footprint being displayed on where their loans are going out to, where their money's been invested into. So it was interesting. It was the first time I'd come across it, and actually that has a direct impact on your life.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that, I assume it will be. I don't know if that's the case in the commercial market, if you had people buying up properties, or whether they still also don't get the best rates if the buildings themselves aren't in the best performance state.
Yeah, I bought, well, funnily enough, I bought a new TV last week, just a small one. And it just surprised me when I opened the box. I mean, this is a really minor thing, but it just surprised me when I opened the box. The EPC rating was taped to the screen of the television. So that was the first thing you saw. And I thought, well, that's new.
We just keep adding pluses to the A's on top, don't we?
It's getting silly now because you get a brand new, I don't know, 65-inch thing or whatever, and it'll say an energy rating of a D on it. You're like, spent a lot of money on that. The first visual you see is that red element there. And suddenly people get turned off by that. But there's nothing those manufacturers can do, because the ERP rating on the products is also taking into account the primary energy source that's going into it.
Of course.
So it all stems from that. But it is, it does make you want to go to the A+++++ ones, you know, etc.
It does, psychological, isn't it?
It is, and that's a big part of it as well. Is how do you incentivize change? We'll stick a green sticker on it with a lot of pluses on it. Super duper.
Super dupes. Yeah, we've done it. Tick.
Yeah.
Sure. I think before we wrap up, should we where people can get in touch with you and Enviroheat and learn a bit more about the businesses, and if they're interested, where can they find you?
And the Hadron Collider, if you know.
Hadron Collider, if you want to tell us. So thank you. So you can find about us on our website, so enviroheat.com, and then you'll find me on LinkedIn and the socials and things like that. But so we're now expanding into more areas now, so commercial, industrial, and things like that. So large hot water tanks and things like that. So we're expanding new products all the time. So
excellent. Well, you saw them first here. Well, thank you both. I have the feeling that we could have talked about this for about another hour. I think there's certainly a lot to cover, but thanks for your time, and we're out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.